Hey everyone, this is part 3 of how I turned my dark basement into this YouTube studio. In this video, I'm going to show you how I framed and sheathed this tool wall. Stick around for some tips on how to locate and cut holes in the walls for things like receptacles and window openings. So once I finished my pallet wood wall build, I felt like I needed something more on this block wall side to make it less ugly. So I decided to build a tool wall. Had I known I was going to build a wall here, I actually would have built it before I did the pallet wall so that the pallet boards could die into it nicely instead of having this little gap here. Here's the process I used to build the wall. Step 1 was framing. There were 3 main design considerations I had when I framed this wall. 1, it couldn't be touching the block wall because we get moisture on this wall and sometimes even mold. So I wanted to have an air gap in between the tool wall and the block wall. 2, I didn't want the frame to take up too much space on the workbench, so using 2x4s was out of the question. Instead, I used 2x2s with a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood over the top, which I figured would be plenty strong to hang a few tools on it. If you're building a full-size wall from floor to ceiling, I would recommend using 2x4s. And 3, it needed to be completely removable so that when I move out of this apartment, I can easily take it down and bring it with me. I did that by making the entire frame its own individual component that was anchored to the workbench and the joists with screws. I can simply remove the plywood and unscrew the frame to release it when I move. Alright, so I started by taking a bunch of measurements so that I could build the frame and then flip it up into place. First, I needed to know how far back the frame should go. I figured it could go as far back as the electrical conduit, so that's the point I marked on the workbench. Next, I needed to know the location of the vertical framing members around the window and the electrical conduit and stuff so that I could mark the bottom plate. I put the bottom plate on the top of the workbench and screwed it down to remove the bow. Then I put a level on top of it, moved it to the desired position, and marked its location on the bottom plate. Once I had all the studs laid out, I needed to know their heights. I stacked a 2x2 on top of the bottom plate to simulate the top plate. And then I used a level across the bottom of the floor joist to measure the heights of my leftmost studs. The floor joists were not all the same heights, so I took measurements at each stud location across the wall and cut all my pieces to size. I didn't have quite enough 2x2s for the whole thing, so I had to rip some 2x4s down to the same dimensions as the store-bought 2x2. Then I was ready to assemble the entire frame with 2.5-inch screws. Just to be safe, I pre-drilled before driving all the screws in. There was only room on the 2x2s for 1 screw at the top and the bottom of the studs. Technically, the studs were able to spin at this point, but later on, they were constrained by blocking. After assembling everything, I was able to tip the frame up. Of course, I didn't plan for there being electrical conduit and other stuff in the way, so I couldn't actually tip it up, but I was narrowly able to slide it in from the side once I moved my work light. Once it was in place, I made sure the frame was square to the other wall, and then I screwed it to the frame of the workbench and the floor joists. You can see here I just used a clamp between the joists and the frame to help pull it into square. I guess there are a few extra framing members that still need to be added at this point. Finally, I cut and installed 2x4 blocking in case I needed some larger and stronger backing for hanging things. The conduit was just a bit in the way, so I notched out one of the blocks to fit over it. Okay, on to the next step, which was sheathing the wall with plywood. The trickiest part of this step was cutting the holes for the window and the receptacle, but it wasn't that bad, and I'll show you exactly how I did it. I used a 4x8 sheet of 1/2-inch sanded plywood for this wall. I wanted something light in color to contrast the dark pallet wood wall, but honestly you could use anything like OSB or sheetrock or MDF or pretty much whatever you want. So I started by cutting the plywood to size. Next up was locating and cutting the hole for the receptacle. Anytime you can scribe or mark things instead of measuring, it almost always yields a better result. So keeping that in mind, I set a level up against the side of the box, made sure it was plumb, and then marked the top and the bottom of the box on that level. Then I marked the left and right sides of the box on the workbench and extended the lines out. I did give myself a little bit of clearance here on all 4 sides, but didn't end up needing it. When I put the plywood back up, I made sure to slide it all the way to the left into place. I grabbed that same level, referenced the same lines on my workbench, made sure it was plumb, and transferred my marks to the plywood. So there are a ton of ways to cut these holes out, but I'm going to use a jigsaw and a router. If this were drywall, you could just use a basic drywall saw. At this point, I didn't know if I was going to be able to find an outlet cover to fit this box. So I wanted my cuts to be as clean as possible in case they were visible in the end. If you do have an outlet cover, these cuts can actually be pretty rough because they're going to get covered up anyways. Scoring the wood first really helps to prevent tear out when you go and cut near the line. My knife must not have been very sharp because it didn't do a really good job of cutting those cross grain fibers and kind of left a mess. But a sharp knife should leave a really clean line. After scoring, I drilled a hole in the corner so that I could slip a jigsaw in there and cut out most of the waste. I left a little material so I could come back with a router to clean it up. Then I grabbed some 1/4 inch MDF material that I had laying around to use as a straight edge guide for the router. I aligned the edges of the MDF perfectly with the scored lines. The blue tape and CA glue method held the MDF on really well. I set up the router with the top bearing flush trim bit such that the bearing was riding on the MDF only, and then carefully cleaned up the hole from left to right, making sure not to go past my lines on the bottom and the right sides. Then I switched my template to those sides, repeating the process. I squared up the corners with a chisel and removed the blue tape residue. Finally, I slid the panel into place. It fit perfectly around the electrical box and turned out pretty clean aside from just some chipping from my dull scoring knife. Overall, this method did take a little bit longer, but to this day, I still have not been able to find an outlet cover that fits this duplex box. So I'm glad I took the time to make it look neat. I'm gonna hop in here and just say real quick, if you guys are enjoying this video, please do me a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so that you can see new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks so much, guys. So at this point, I still needed to cut the hole out for the window, but luckily I could use the window frame as a guide for a router. The bit I used was a 1/2 inch panel pilot bit. It was really slick because I could plunge directly into the plywood with that same bit and then follow the frame of the window all the way around like a pattern. I set the plunge depth stop using a plywood cutoff such that the cutter went only as deep as the plywood. Then I went ahead and plunged where I was confident the window opening was and moved to the right until I hit the window frame. Then I followed the frame down and around clockwise. You really have to make sure you keep this bit moving because at one point it did get a little bit squirrely on me and somehow cut into the window frame in the corner. So I kept moving around the frame, and then right at about this moment, I realized I didn't consider that the router base would be too wide to route next to the floor joists. So I had to come up with plan B. I took the plywood off the wall, vacuumed up the mess I made, finished cutting the opening with the circular saw, and cleaned up the corners with a handsaw. Now that the window was cut out, I could move on to finishing the plywood. First I did a quick sanding with 180 grit. Then I applied Minwax Polycrylic finish in ultra flat sheen to minimize camera glare. This is a low odor, water-based product I've been using for years because it doesn't cause wood to yellow. To apply the finish, I used a foam roller. So the big problem I encountered with the roller was that it introduced a ton of air bubbles into the finish. Maybe there is a roller out there that doesn't cause air bubbles, but I think all rolling is going to have the risk of introducing air bubbles into your finish regardless. Instead, I would probably use a large applicator pad if you want a bubble-free finish. I didn't care about this bad enough to redo it, so I just did a second coat, let it dry, and hung the plywood with 1¼ inch screws. And that was pretty much it for building the plywood wall. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up this video because it's getting pretty long, but please check back for part 4 where I show you how I made this rustic oak floating shelf from a piece of scrap at the mill. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.